Good afternoon. My name is Joseph Tucker Edmonds, and I'm the Associate Director for the Center for the Study of Religion and American Culture. Welcome to the second half of the sixth season of the Center's Religion and series. Religion and is a series of monthly conversations between leading academics and practitioners hosted by the Center to engage and enhance critically important conversations on the state of religion in America and really throughout the world. The last episode was an exciting conversation that explored the questions of new and emerging models of religious studies departments, and it also raised important questions as to how departments balance the promise of employability, as we were calling job readiness, with the value of critical humanistic inquiry. I want to thank Rachel Wheeler, Julie Byrne, Amy DeRogatis, and Russ McCutcheon for a transparent and quite encompassing engagement of models and concerns facing faculty, departments, and graduates of our programs. If you didn't get a chance to catch it, please check it out on our YouTube channel, or if you just want to listen to this or any of our episodes, we are now available wherever you download your favorite podcasts. Today's panelists will explore religion and demographics. The panelists are engaging and thinking about a number of questions. Primarily, how does quality data shape our interpretation of the religious landscape in the United States? We know that religion data is increasingly used beyond the work of researchers and academics in media and classrooms and congregations and beyond to describe patterns and to make strategic decisions. So today we're going to be thinking about how this democratic category or this demographic category can be integral for our institution's products and priorities and the ways that they interact with religious communities. So, like, buckle your seatbelts, put your math and thinking caps on, because our panel of scholars will explore the importance of collecting and interpreting reputable religion data and how they offer data-driven insights for understanding the evolving religious landscape. So let me jump right in to introduce our host and panelists for today's conversation. Today's host is Dr. Erica Dahlhoff. Dr. Erica Dahlhoff is the Associate Director of Research for the Lake Institute on Faith and Giving at the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy here at Indiana University, Indianapolis. She has authored numerous publications on congregations and congregational vitality. And Dr. Dahlhoff is currently the co-chair of the 2030 U.S. Religion Census and the current president of the Association of Statisticians of American Religious Bodies. I told y'all, put on your thinking caps. Our next panelist who is here with us is Bashir Muhammad, who is a senior research at the Pew Research Center with extensive experience studying Muslim American communities. More broadly, his research examines religious identities, beliefs, and practices in the United States, with particular focus on the intersection of religion and race. He has led a number of public opinion studies on the experience and attitudes of Muslim Americans, the religious profile of Asian Americans, and faith amongst Black Americans, amongst many others. Thank you, Bashir, for joining us. Our next panelist is Allison Norton, who is the Associate Professor of Migration Studies and Congregational Life at Hartford International University, where she co-directs the Hartford Institute for Religion Research and directs the Pastoral Innovation Network of New England. She is most interested in applied research that makes a tangible difference for religious communities and congregations, and she is currently co-authoring a book titled Migrant God and Migrant Faith. Our last and not least panelist is Gina Zerlo, who is a senior researcher and lecturer in world Christianity at Harvard Divinity School. Her research interests include world Christianity, sociology of religion, quantitative studies, and gender studies. She is the editor of the World Christian Database and the World Religion Database, and her latest books are Women in World Christianity, Building and Sustaining a Global Movement, and the Compact Atlas of Global Christianity that she co-edited with Kenneth Ross and Todd M. Johnson. I am so excited to have this fantastic panel and host to lead us today. And I'm going to hand over this conversation to my colleague here at Indiana University, Dr. Erica Dahlhoff.
Thank you so much, Joseph, and thank you to the Center for hosting the podcast, and thank you for all of the panelists for being here today. Religion demographic data may not strike some as a glamorous topic, but as my colleagues here know, this is a dynamic field where changes in technology and the broader social landscape mean that our methods, questions, and audiences are rapidly evolving. For example, events like the pandemic required researchers to reconsider how core concepts in religion research are defined and measured. For instance, how should online worship attendance of religious services be measured in context with in-person worship services? And how are religious institutions redefining membership whenever you have regular participants who may be joining online and may actually never physically set foot in a congregation that they consider their home congregation? At the same time, technology continues to change what data is possible to gather and how we're gathering it, with the use of AI becoming rapidly part of this conversation. We're also seeing other challenges in this area of work, some of which have been impacting religion data collection for a long time. For instance, high quality religion data is expensive and time consuming to collect. And also there's fewer religious organizations that necessarily have the resources to devote to collecting data within their own religious bodies compared to what we might have seen in the past. Yet journalists, academics, researchers, and students are just a few among the many audiences that depend on this religious data to understand the ever-changing religious landscape. So, with these forces in mind, I'd like to lead off our discussion today with asking our panelists first to give us just some brief context for their work and tell us how religion data is collected, shared, and interpreted in your setting. Who's the primary audience for your data? And then also, I'd love for you to reflect a little bit on where you're seeing the most interesting intersections between demographic trends and our understanding of the religious landscape, either in the US or globally.
Thanks, Erica. I'll jump in here. So at Harvard Institute for Religion Research, when we think about how we collect data, it's a model that is highly relational and collaborative for the most part. So we're focused on understanding congregations in the US from an interreligious perspective and have drawn on this collaborative model for now more than 25 years of bringing together representatives of different faith groups who survey their own congregations within their community. And so, Erica, you know this as chair of the research committee of FACT, that this process is one that it's an ongoing relationship. Some of these folks have been here, members of FACT, for the full 25 years. But it's also a process where we're collaboratively designing our research instruments. So everybody has kind of got a seat at the table and is working together to really identify across the U.S. landscape what are the most kind of relevant and pressing questions that clergy, that congregational leaders, that denominational leaders, different faith groups are asking. And then how can we collect and analyze data in that way? And then we're also doing this, exploring the pandemic impact on congregation study here at Harvard Institute. So that's wrapping up. We've been collecting data for 5 years in a mixed method way, combining now 7 national surveys, a longitudinal panel, and 81 case study congregations to try to understand what are some of the emerging changes that you just talked about, right, around online worship and other various features that are kind of coming out of this last 5 years.
I want to pick up on a thread that Allison just tugged about collaborative research. I think actually all 4 of us have collaborated and are collaborating in different areas in the demography of religion. And so I think this is a really important piece of what we all do at our respective institutions. I know this is true at the World Christian Database and the World Religion Database, because what we're doing is studying 18 categories of religion and non-religion in all of the world's 237 countries. Now, there's no way me sitting in an office in Boston can know exactly what's happening among trends in every single religion in every single country of the world. And so I have a huge network of collaborators and contacts and people who help inform estimates, especially when, quote, official data is not available or maybe isn't really telling the whole story on the ground. So, for example, I just sent out dozens of emails to people who know Chinese Christianity really well because the official data is lacking. And it's really this on the ground perspective that I can't get myself here in Boston, but there are lots of people who are much closer to the situation who can help refine and inform me about what's going on with religion and Christianity in China. So this is one of the things I love, frankly, about the demography of religion is that it's kind of a small academic community, but we're all really connected and we really work together and benefit from each other's work.
So yeah, I'll jump in and say I agree with Gina. It's really is it's nice to sort of see all you guys again, and it's one of the great things about the work is the fact that you work with these scholars, you get to know them well, you can engage on various topics, explore, well, how are you guys thinking about, the shifts in attendance, for example, which all of us were trying to think about a few years in the last few years. Like, okay, we measured attendance for a long time a certain way, and now that the pandemic has hit and now that like online attendance is really spiked, like how do we think about that? How do we think about the ways in which that shift has happened? How do we think about the ways that shift influences both our measurement and also people's religious experiences? And so that's all, that's all stuff that we sort of work through as an academic community. In terms of the way Pew Research Center collects the data, most of it is nationally representative samples. In the US, it's primarily address-based random selection, but we also do surveying in a number of other countries, some of which is random digit phone dialing, some of which is sort of in-person, sort of random walk, stratified clustering. So various ways in which we sort of build out sort of statistically nationally representative samples for a given country in order to understand sort of polling data. So that's most of what we do. Although we do a little bit of qualitative, especially when there's like a topic that we don't really know how to explore properly. And then in terms of our audience, I'd say that our audience is a little different from a lot of academics because we're mostly trying to engage with what we call the informed public. So we're not our primary audience isn't academics. And while clergy members are part of our audience, they're not, central to our audience. They're just sort of a part of the broader audience of people who are interested in sort of fact-based understandings about the world, and in particular about religion, and really are open to and interested in understanding, well, here's my intuition about this, but is it accurate? Is it right? Whether that's just because they sort of personally are curious, whether it's because they're sort of religious, sort of exploring religion for themselves, whether they're in a debate over dinner and like, oh wait, no, what you said this, but I don't actually think most all Muslims are immigrants. Let's go look at the Pew Research Center and see what the data is on that. I don't actually think all Christians are Republicans. Let's go look at the Pew Research Center and see. So like that's really a window that an area that we try to engage in, to inform the way people think, the way people discuss, the way people make decisions about these things. And as I said, part of that is clergy members trying to figure out, well, how does my congregation fit into a broader landscape? But it's really just sort of all sorts of folks.
The one project that I'm involved in that was mentioned at the beginning, and I know several of us are already collaborating on, is the 2030 U.S. Religion Census. And for that particular project, it is, to go back to Gina's comment, it's extremely highly collaborative, and it can only really be done through collaboration. This is a study that's been done since the 1950s, and it is actually a county level study of congregations and religious adherence to understand changes over time. And one of the things that's been interesting to me being part of this project is actually how, because we collect this information every decade, we actually see pretty big changes actually methodologically in how we're collecting the data. And some of that also is a reflection of some of the changes that we're seeing in the religious landscape. So for instance, historically, the data had really been collected by reaching out to different faith groups and basically asking them for lists. Where are your congregations? How many adherents are associated with each congregation, and getting these coded to a county. And that worked for many groups for a long time, but really what we've seen in the last several decades is the increase of groups that are not so easily counted that way. In particular, the rise of independent and non-denominational Christian congregations, as well as the increase in non-Christian groups in the United States, where for these groups, there may not necessarily be a central organization that's collecting data, that's coordinating activities. So we actually have to change our strategies on how we actually reach out to these groups, and how we even understand what a congregation and a religious adherent is, depending on the group that we're working with. And so that's definitely, been a nice, I guess, intersection of seeing how things have changed over time, how religion demographics have changed this, but also I'd say collaboration's been really key because I'm certainly not an expert on, every group in here and really not an expert on, almost all of them. So I really rely on working with colleagues, like Gina suggested, to understand what's happening in certain locations. Are we asking questions in the correct way? Are we looking in the right places? And so that's been, for me, a really fascinating dynamic. So I think one thing that I was also, interested in relatedly is we've all been on these long-term projects. And so we've seen a lot of the challenges over time and a lot of the shifts over time in collecting this data. So I want to know from where you are right now, what are some of the challenges that you've encountered? And, why do these big long-term studies continue to be really important?
So the World Christian Database Project has been running, it started in the 1960s from Nairobi, Kenya, actually. And it was a lot easier to collect these kinds of data back then because most, especially for Christianity, was very institutional. So much like Erica just described, you could just call up all of the major Christian denominations and find out how many adherents they had in every country that they existed and kind of tally it up and you're done. But one trend that we've seen is this gradual deinstitutionalization of religion. And so that makes our work really hard because the fewer and fewer of these centralized sources that exist, the harder and harder it is to know what is happening on the ground. So at the World Christian Database, we collect three kind of major buckets of data. One is government censuses. So about half of the world's countries ask a religion question on their census, so we can collect that information. But we're also collecting information on race, ethnicity, language, country of origin, ancestry, anything related to essentially the human population to see if we can make some assumptions about religious affiliation based on where people are from. We're also collecting and looking at the data that all of you produce in different surveys, social science surveys, to get a read on beliefs and attitudes. But then we too are collecting data from religious communities themselves. So we'll get the data from the Assemblies of God and the Episcopal Church USA and all other, I mean, we're talking like there's like tens of thousands of these groups thinking globally. And then we triangulate those data to come up with our best estimate for every religion in every country of the world. So if you want to know how many Assemblies of God are in Zimbabwe or how many United Methodists are in Brazil, the World Christian Database is the place for that. But an increasing thing we've seen is an increase of what we call unaffiliated Christians, people who are just Christians, not attached to any kind of formal institution. And these are some of the hardest Christian communities to find because where do they show up? So I'm seeing this more and more. I was actually just in Tokyo last week, where unaffiliated Christianity is the largest group of Christians in the country. And they were really appreciative that such a category exists because otherwise they don't get counted if you only look at formal membership lists. So I think going forward, this is going to be a bigger and bigger problem, both in the US and globally.
Yeah, I agree, Gina. I'm thinking about, just on the challenges side, right? It requires a kind of agility and flexibility and kind of being experimental or kind of exploratory and sort of saying where are the gaps and how can we respond? And this kind of approach, especially if you're dealing with mostly applied audiences, means that it's like really a lot about where are the networks. And so I think for us with faith communities today, we have depended a lot on institutional data, right? Having religion in institutions that can, then give us and hand over data. And this is just like we're saying, eroding in many ways. And so part of it is like, where are those other networks that are outside of the traditional religious institutions, but that can still provide a sort of an avenue, right, into capturing some of this information. But I also think one of the things that we've experimented with a little bit with our attender survey that we did in 2024 is we had about 24,000 responses to that survey. Half of them were through our Faith Communities Today model, right? So working through faith groups. Each of these faith groups own their own data, right? And kind of that the request comes from within that tradition. And then the other half, we used two panels, right? We Prolific and a Survey Monkey panel, and separate, analyzing those two kind of sources separately would have yielded one kind of picture. Our paid survey panels were much younger folks. They looked demographically very different than working through faith communities themselves. But together, they gave us actually a really robust picture of congregational life in the US. So I think there's just this opportunity to sort of question, right? How are the ways we've always done things? And then what are the new avenues, whether that's through new partnerships, new networks? And I think, as we continue to discuss, like, what are those emerging realities when we think about data in the age of AI, right? So there's I think, a whole kind of broad area there.
And I would just say from my perspective at Pew, a lot of our work, sort of the way we collect data, might be thought of as kind of a brute force method. It's a lot of, we call all the numbers, we send mail to all the people, and then we ask them various questions about their religious experiences and identities. And so the difficulty there is a cost difficulty, right? Once upon a time, you could call people and 70% of them would happily, sit on the phone with you for 10 minutes and tell you whatever questions you wanted to ask. Now we're sending mailings we're sending, 6 or 8 mailings to their address, including, prepaid incentives, in order to get 30 or 40% of them to respond to the survey. So that's a lot more expensive. One of the ways that we and a lot of organizations that have this sort of brute force approach have dealt with it is by creating panels. So if you go through the exercise of, sending, 8 different mailings to people and convincing them, like, no, really, it's please give us your time. Once you get them to give you their time once, often it's like, okay, well, can I call you back next month with a different set of questions? So that's the way that we and a lot of organizations have started to sort of engage with this, sort of deal with this difficulty of sort of the rising cost of recruiting people sort of in a random way that's make sure it's nationally representative. Is once you recruited them, you want to retain them for some period of time and continue to ask them a variety of questions. The other piece of the question you asked is sort of the value of doing this. Like, why are we going through the exercise of spending all the money and the time to collect all this data? And I think the answer for us, and I think probably the other panelists would agree, is that absent that exercise, people have lots of assumptions they can fill in. It's not that decision makers won't make decisions. It's not that people won't move through life interacting with religious groups, and it's just that they'll be doing this on the basis of assumptions and guesses rather than data and facts. And so I think that's really the value there is that we all feel like this matters and people interact with it. It continues to be the case that in the US, most people do identify with a religion. It continues to be the case that in the US, a lot of people, do go to attend religious services. But there's also a growing religiously unaffiliated population. So like, who are these people? How are they similar? How are they different? How are the different denominations different? How are they growing and shrinking? How does it vary by age? Those are all important questions to a lot of people. And if we can't answer them, they're just going to fill it in with like, well, my best guess is this. Well, I know 3 people that think this. Well, I saw this on TV. And I think as scholars, we all think that it'd be better to have data than to have guesses.
I have a kind of funny story, Bashir, about that, thinking about just disinformation and religion. I have been kind of taking a look at, the U.S. religion census media kind of engagement, right? And sort of looking at those stats of sort of when are people kind of trying to go to the U.S. religion census? How's it being used? And we've seen kind of two spikes. After October 7th, there was this spike of people really like, what's going on and what do Muslims and Jews look like in the US, and going to like kind of religion, trying to find some of that. And more recently with the war in Iran, right? Another kind of spike of surge of people who are either themselves hungry for not just disinformation, but trying to find some answers to real questions. But we also see this in the Grok chat box. So like literally at Laura Loomer, no, Muslims are not taking over, the US country. And you can see from the US religion census XYZ, right? And that's not, I mean, that's not always the best use of the data, but I think it shows this sort of way in which these narratives and this disinformation can be widespread, right? And yet there's still a hunger in a lot of places for people to say, no, what really is the story, and where are the sources of data where we can answer some of these questions. So there is still a desire, right, for these kind of trusted places.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think that I think in the absence of good quality data, I think people often will fill in what's their immediate experience, and they don't necessarily know if that's coming, if this is generalizable or not. I know when I've spoken to a lot of congregational groups, especially in denominations where being a small congregation is the norm, often the most shocking thing I say is that actually their experience as a small congregation is the most common experience that they may have in the denomination, because many of these congregations think, well, everybody else has a huge 500-person congregation and we're the only one with 50 people on a Sunday morning, when in fact, actually that's the case. And so many congregations are so surprised when I tell them that. And but then I think of what different decisions would you make if you knew that actually there was several small congregations in the area? Would you think about collaboration differently? Maybe you're all trying to have your own youth group, but maybe it would be a better way to steward your resources by combining forces, or maybe joining together with faith groups that aren't like your own, to work together on a community project that you're both interested in. So I think there's a lot of ways this data can be used, not just for information, but I think also for action, and kind of seeing your world a little bit differently and thinking of broader possibilities. So I think kind of with that in mind, I know we've talked a little bit about, some of your audiences, but I'm curious about what's your hope for how people will use your data? And in that data, what do you think people should be paying attention to? I know we've picked out a couple of threads here, and I'm curious to know from what you're seeing, what do you hope, people will notice from what you're sharing?
I want to make the local global connection here. That's my job, is to be the global person in every room and to remind people that the United States is not the center of all things. But for
Says
those of us
you.
who, no, no, Bashir. Well, because I really believe this is true, that you really cannot understand religion in the United States without understanding global trends. I mean, this is a very international place, and what happens in the US impacts other places around the world and vice versa. So I always say, the US is just one of 237 countries, that I study, but it is a really important one. So, for example, the US is the country with the most Christians in the world for now. And one thing that we did in terms of kind of reaching out to our audience to help them understand current trends, is we did a study of the amount and who would be most impacted by people under Trump's deportation plans. So before he came into office, there were all these discussions about the largest mass deportation in American history. And so we asked the question, well, who's going to get deported? And so we did the religious demography of who is most likely at risk for deportation. And we estimated it was about 10 million Christians. And of those, 61% were Catholic, 13% evangelical, another 7% other kinds of Christians. And I think a lot of people maybe were surprised to hear actually it's Christians who are most at risk for deportation. And of those, which seems counterintuitive to some of the desires of the current administration in terms of, what's his most interest, what the administration is most interested in promoting. And so for us, that was a way of doing applied research to provide an analysis that literally no one else could provide because you had to have the data from outside the US and the data from inside the US in order to see how these certain policies will impact the US. So I think there's a lot of implications of this kind of research that can only be done again in collaboration, especially that particular project, to really kind of give teeth to what people are experiencing in their lives, and as Bashir has said, give them some language of good hard research data to help form their opinions about things that are happening in their own lives. But for me, it's the local global connection that is, one of the key areas of this work, I think.
Erica, thinking about what you were saying on, our audiences and the questions that people have, and, most people don't want data for data's sake, right? They do want to either answer a question that they already have or have research to help them inform their decision making, their processes, right? It's this very actionable side. And I think, for those of us that are scholars, we're not often trained on that side nearly as well as we are on making a contribution to the academy. And so I think for me, it's really that intersection of how do you do applied work well, right? How do you do it in a way that it has, the robust research behind it, but it's in connection, not only in responding to, right, some of the realities that people care the most about, but that it is also communicated well, which is also something we are not usually trained on, right? Like I'll just say, like academics, we do not do this well. We are actually conditioned to speak to a very niche and very small audience. And so I think this work of this communication side is something I think is our role, and something that increasingly we're going to have to get better at into the future. And so thinking about that, like what are the questions that like people are asking, but that also can be actionable in connection to congregations in the US, which is kind of the intersection of our work. I'm thinking there's all these questions around what's going on with young adults, like what's going on with young people, right? Are they spiritual but not religious? Are they going to church? Is there, if you look at kind of some recent stuff out of Barna and other places, like is there this resurgence and there's this, young adults are coming back to church? Well, I mean, this is where our data, I think, can get at this intersection if we can communicate it well. And so I think not only like religious landscape, you have a lot of great work there with us in Faith Community Day. We're seeing similar things, right? We're seeing that overall, young adults 18 to 34 who participate in congregations are still significantly underrepresented, right, in relation to the overall US population. And that their attendance is not frequent, right? Out of compare across generational cohorts, they are the least likely to attend regularly. There are traditional markers of religiosity, prayer, reading scripture, etc., also right lower compared to other generations. And yet, I think research can yield some insights that in this case congregational leaders would be asking, how do we better engage our young adults? So, some of our data there shows that Gen Z is a little different. They actually are more likely to have increased their involvement and engagement compared to other generations over the last 5 years. They're more likely to have come to a church for the first time or to return after a long sort of lapse. They have some higher levels of volunteering. So there are some, I think, insights here, but it's our job to be able to communicate this well. And so I see that as a really important role for scholars at the intersection of religion and whatever it is, right, into the future is that we do the good work on communication and dissemination.
I want to sort of pick up on this sort of local global thread because I think it's definitely a very important one and one that like Allison, as you said, like there are a number of events that were happening in the Middle East that sort of spiked interest and also shifted experiences for folks in the U.S. Right? We did some polling that included Muslim Americans and Jewish Americans, and their experiences have significant. They've had significant experiences, difficulties, etc. In the wake of some of these things. And again, it's one of those things where if we can sort of quantify that and capture that in a way that's meaningful and helpful and gives voice to some of those experiences beyond, anecdotes here and there, that I feel like that's a value add. Like, this is not just an anecdote. This is not just a one-off here. We can talk about how frequently this is happening. How many people share this experience, which can be both validating for the individuals who are like, well, I had this experience, but is it just me? And also a valuable insight for the folks who aren't part of those communities. They're like, well, how are they dealing with this stuff? Well, we've got some data that can help you understand this. The ways in which sort of the international events are affecting them, and also the way just domestic events are affecting folks. Gina, to your point about whether it's immigration shifts or any other number of things. Communication is really something, picking up on the other thread Allison pointed out, is really something that we at the Pew Research Center think long and hard about. It's one of those things, when we hire folks, we make it a point to say, look, you're going to be talking to a different audience. We go through exercises of training all of our researchers in how to talk to the media. We go through the exercise of training people and retraining people in how to write so that people who don't have PhDs can understand them. You come out of your dissertation writing exercise and you've written this very dense book, intentionally dense for 4 people. It's like, no, that was great. You've shown you're an expert. Now show us that you can explain some of this stuff to, your mom, your next door neighbor, to just sort of random folks. And that's really central to our mission, because it's all well and good to say well, we know all these things and we've got all this data, but if it's not getting into the hands of people who have the questions, who are making the decisions, it's not having the impact that we really want to have.
Well, thank you, everyone. I want to remind our audience that we would love to see your questions submitted to the Q&A. So if you have some questions for us, please feel free to submit them. While we're waiting for some questions to come in, I also wanted to add, what one of the threads that's been discussed on, communicating well to our audiences and how to make our work practical. And in addition to learning how to not speak academic-ese to, a broad audience, I think one thing that I've had to learn, and I try to view the data through a lens of what about this data would actually be interesting to someone in a congregation? Because I think some of the things that are really interesting to me academically may not have any relevance for somebody who's trying to make decisions and has 1,000 other things to do and is struggling to balance a budget and deal with people's personal needs, and also trying to figure out things like, are we seeing fewer young adults participate because young adults aren't participating in religion? Or does it also have something to do with these larger population trends that mean that young adults are leaving our area for jobs in other locations? What are the overarching trends, and what can I do with them? I feel like is one of the things that I often hear is well, this is great, so interesting, but what should I do about it? How do I actually act on this data? So I think one of the things that is valuable for us to research is this thing of what would be important, and then what do we do with it? What would somebody actually do with this information? So that's something else I've been thinking about with this work.
I mean, I think that to some extent picks up on one of the threads and some of the questions here, in that if the goal is really to be sort of relevant or have an impact on whether it's congregations or policy or et cetera, it's not just an exercise in communication, right? You ask different questions. There are different research questions that are going to be relevant to congregation leaders, then that are going to be relevant to policymakers, then that are going to be relevant to scholars of religion. And it's realizing that up front. If that's really your goal, then often you're best served to really keep that front and center from the beginning, rather than trying to, like, on the back end, well, how can I make this question that was really an academic question relevant to this or that congregation? It might not be there are lots of academic questions that are very interesting, defining religion, right? Like, this one of these sort of interesting academic exercises we go through about, like, what is really religion and what is not, and what are the, that's not something that is going to be relevant for very many decision makers or very many congregations. They're like, I know who's a member of the Church of God in Christ. Like, I don't need this debate. Like, this is not helpful for me. What I need to know is how to get more people into my congregation. And so it's really sort of thinking about from the beginning, like, what are you trying to do with this research?
I think one thing that people have been really interested in that is part kind of academic question, part kind of applied question is who is actually religious in the world? As I speak and talk to a lot of people, a lot of Christian communities around the world in particular, I always give this example, and I don't do surveys, so this is my interpretation of you survey researchers. So, you get asked the question, what is your religion? And you check Christian. And then, do you ever go to church? No. Do you believe in God? No. Do you ever read the Bible? No. Okay, the next person, what is your religion? None. Do you attend religious services? Yes. Do you read scripture? Yes. Do you believe in God? Yes. Well, which of these people is religious and which one of them is not? And I think that is a really helpful way, actually, for like normal people to be like, oh, this is actually kind of complicated about who is and who isn't. And for us, this is like a very difficult problem that we have to figure out. You get survey responses like that, and what do you do with them? So I think there is like this interesting practicality, frankly, of the demography of religion. It might sound like this super duper niche thing, but actually it has real life implications. Like, fertility rates of different religions that's a big deal in Nigeria. That's a huge deal in Nigeria. Now that Nigeria is majority Muslim after being majority Christian for many decades, purely because of birth rates. Like, Nigerians have a vested interest in which religion is growing faster than the other. So there's some real life implications of demographic work, and frankly, the weight of the decisions that we have to make and the assumptions that we have to work through in order to produce this work has real implications for policy and real implications for people on the ground.
And part of that is just being able to tell that complex story well, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's like not the single story, but you're able to layer in ways that people can understand and grasp, right? So like one of the things that we've seen, over time with the Faith Communities Today data is that oftentimes if you compare male and female clergy leaders, oftentimes the congregations that women are leading are not thriving in the same way that the congregations men are leading. Somebody could take that and say women are bad clergy leaders. But the reality is, with data, right, you can nuance that and say, well, look, what are the kinds of congregations that they're disproportionately leading, right? They tend to be congregations that are already not thriving themselves. And so it's being able to sort of, I think, engage data, whether it's going to be, toward policy or towards, congregational action, that doesn't just tell the simplified story, that uses that data to paint this broader picture in a way that people can grasp, that can be compelling, that can be understood.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I feel like leaning into that complexity in a real sense is one of the key responsibilities, especially for those of us that do quantitative data, where it's very possible to sort of say, well, we ask people what their religion is, and the people who said that they're unaffiliated, they're the ones who aren't religious. We're done. Here's your number, 37%. Yeah. And to find ways of sort of leaning into, well, actually, it's more complicated than that. There are lots of folks who say that they don't have a religion, but also say that they attend religious services and religion's important to them, and vice versa. There are folks who are like, well, yeah, I'm Catholic. I also don't really believe in God. I haven't been to church in 15 years. Mm-hmm. And sort of finding ways to to surface that complexity is really central, I think, especially in an environment where people will often, if they are, even if they take the step of asking the question, like, what's the data, will often be like, okay, I just want a number. Like, just give me the 20, the fastest possible answer. And like, okay, that's fine. How can I give you the fastest possible answer that point out the fact that this is complicated? You know, the fast answer isn't necessarily one number. Maybe it's, two numbers. Maybe it's one number with a caveat, except, so how can we sort of find ways to sort of lean into the complexity without saying, well, what you need to do is you need to read these 3 journal articles. And that will explain to you the ways in which this, and so I feel like it's that tension between sort of leaning into the complexity, but in a way that's understandable.
Yeah, I think that really, I think, so well encapsulates why our role is important here is that, so rarely can any of our pieces of data stand alone. And I think one of our critical roles is to not only share that complexity, but also communicate why that complexity and nuance is really important for understanding the story, that this can't be boiled down to 1 to 2 pieces of data, that there's a lot of context behind these, and that's important for this understanding the meaning. I want to turn briefly to some of the questions from our audience. One question that's been asked of us is there a piece of data that you're currently really interested in, and why?
I'll start. I'll jump in. The piece of data that I'm currently most interested in is exploring folks who are religiously unaffiliated but retain a connection to a religious tradition. We've been exploring different ways of capturing these folks, of understanding these folks. People who say, for example, that, I am culturally Muslim or culturally Catholic or, culturally Jewish. What does that mean? How prevalent is that? It's a category that we haven't, those of us who have been doing sort of quantitative work haven't consistently captured. Often we've sort of stopped when we said, okay, so you're religiously unaffiliated, so we don't need to ask you any more questions about religion. But it turns out that a lot of folks do retain those ties. And so unpacking, well, what does that mean? How is that, how does that affect their daily life, is something that's been of interest to me, and that I'm working on. And that I think is important in part because often the experiences that folks have about sort of the size of congregations, about the ways in which religion appears in the world, isn't just about the folks who sort of identify in a strict sense. So, for example, we find that there are lots of folks who say that they're religiously unaffiliated, culturally Muslim, and will show up to the mosque for Eid prayer. And so, that broader category, including those cultural folks, is probably more relevant if you're trying to understand, well, do we need to close the schools for Eid? Well, how many people are going to be in there? Well, we've got this number of people that are Muslim, but also this other number of people that say they're religiously unaffiliated, but culturally are Muslim and are planning on going to Eid prayer and are not going to. So there are ways in which those broader categories can be really important. And so that's something that I'm particularly interested in right now.
I can tie my question to another question from Grego about non-denominational churches, and about the just Christians. I think about these people all the time, and it's actually really similar to what Bashir just described. So we know in these processes of secularization, the first thing that people stop doing is public religious practice. They'll stop going to church. The next is private, so they'll stop believing. The last thing to go, actually, is self-identification as religious. So people will retain, whether it's cultural or nominal or whatever it is, whatever adjective you want to put on it, some kind of affiliation, self-identification as Christian, long after they stop going to church and stop reading scripture or whatever it is. And so we actually tend to still count those people Christian. That is the thing, because again, we're doing global work. That is the one thing we feel reasonably confident that we can measure in every single country of the world is who self-identifies as Christian or each religion. And so the problem is measuring the gap, right? The gap between the institutional people that we know for sure and then the quote cultural people that we know are out there, but we're not quite sure. So to answer Grego's question is what is the gap between these two communities? And as a result, we do report kind of higher figures for Christians, say in Latin America and Western Europe, or frankly, all of Europe, where like everybody was Christian for a long time, but now we are seeing these trends moving away. But at the end of the day, people they want to be born in a church and buried in a church and buried in a church. That means something to us, and that means something to them. So this is something that literally keeps me up at night, frankly, of trying to figure out how to wrap my arms around this globally.
Yeah, I think for us, if you could pop over here to our offices, there have been really robust conversations the last week about the results of our latest survey, which is, kind of just now being analyzed. Um, and again, our kind of intersection is the congregational side. So, Gina, we're kind of that's not the question that's keeping me up at night, although it's a very good one. But really thinking about, what do congregational leaders care about and are thinking about, and so we are seeing now that we have 5 years of exploring the pandemic impact on congregations data, some really fascinating trends around a picture of rebound. So this sort of here's where we started out when it comes to finances, attendance, volunteering, right? All of these things, and there was this downward blip down, pandemic, and then what we're really seeing with our latest data is a sort of a rebound, and so that's where we're kind of at. We're talking about this. What do we see happening here? What does this mean, right, for clergy and for congregations and for denominations, and how do we interpret this? And that's back to that, like, these questions around how we can collect the data, but then we also have to make it translatable, understandable, right? And so who are the voices you sort of invite in to that process of trying to make sense of and interpret some of the trends. So that's kind of where we are right now.
One of the things that I've been thinking about is, of course, Lake Institute is part of the Lilly Family School philanthropy. So one of the big things that we look at is giving. And at Lake, of course, we're really interested in giving to religion. But one of the questions that I think has really started to impact our work a little bit, or maybe change the way we think about religious giving, is that, someone may give to their congregation, and that's pretty easily labeled as religious giving. But what if somebody's religious faith motivates them to, say, donate to an environmental organization or an animal organization? How do we understand people's interpretation of their religious faith and how they operationalize that in ways that we actually can't necessarily measure very well? So I think this touches on some of what you're saying, Gina. And it's actually a fairly complicated question of, what does it mean to be religious? And how is that actually expressed? And so, here we are measuring, largely congregational giving to religiously affiliated organizations, but that might not actually accurately capture what people understand to be religious giving. And I think it's fairly common that even if someone's giving to their own congregation, if they belong to one, that they're also giving to other organizations. Some of these have religious affiliations, some may not, but to somebody, this actually could all be viewed as religious giving. And so I think that's something I've been thinking about is how do we ask questions that are really capture some of these dynamics, but also aren't overly onerous for a survey respondent to answer. Because of course that starts to get complicated, and in a world of survey fatigue, and I know, Bashir, you talked about how challenging it can be to get people to take surveys. And I know we chatted this summer about, how do you get somebody to respond? Sometimes now even money cannot compel somebody to respond to a survey. How do you ask good, thorough, nuanced questions, but actually get somebody to thoughtfully respond to your survey? I think that's something I've been thinking a lot about. Well, I know we only have a couple of minutes left, so I will try to weave in a couple of questions we have from the audience, which is, what do you think is the thing you're most interested in for the future of collecting this data, or a big question? And I know some of the questions we got were around technology, including survey fatigue, who's actually taking surveys, AI and AI trying to take surveys. So what's your biggest question about the future of religion research and religion demographic data gathering?
I'm really curious about how we're going to see sort of more integrated data ecosystems, right? Like we are doing like kind of Gina, you're probably the closest to this, right, out of all of this. But I think that it's going to be less about just collecting sort of survey data, but sort of linking and interpreting and engaging data across a wide array of sources. And I think that this is one of those areas where, again, we are not usually trained for this, to really think this expansively. And it's such a changing reality, right? The role of, large language models and like all that's happening here with the possibilities of overlaying, GIS data with like, right, it's kind of feels overwhelming sometimes, but I really think this is the direction where I see some of the most engaging and robust research going. But it also has all these questions, right, around sort of the ethics, around this, like what's driving this methodological innovation. We know the old models are under strain. That's kind of where we started, right? Our whole conversation. And we know that new approaches are needed, and we know that there needs to be agility, and we need to partner well, and like all these things. Um, but there's still, I think, a lot of questions around how we're going to do this well. What are the ethics involved, right? So I'm really curious to hear Bashir and Gina and Erica kind of what you're thinking about this.
So just sort of following on that thread, I'd say, I 100% agree about, the idea that we need to, and folks are already starting to look at ways in which you can leverage, large language models. You can leverage various sorts of the ways in which there's so much prevalent data. Like, what of that can we leverage to get better information, better answers, better understandings of religion and religious change? One of the tensions there, one of the difficulties that we struggle with, or sort of keeps us up at night, is the flip side to that is it makes it a lot harder to maintain anonymity of your respondents,
Yep.
right?
And what does
If
consent
on the
look like, right? I mean,
Yeah,
that's
I mean, it's sort of like on the one hand, you've got, you can release a survey and it's got, this person's data and it doesn't have their identifying information, but it's got, 15, 20 different variables, whatever it is. And you can safely say, like, with that data set, there's no way you're going to figure out who this person is. But then you start appending, well, but also we can look at, this information from the census, and we can look at this information from, the voter files, and this information from here, and this information and all of a sudden, it becomes a lot less. I'm a lot less confident and so it's like, okay, so it actually puts us sometimes in a difficult situation where traditionally we want to release as much of our data as we can to the public, to academics, et cetera, so that folks can do their own analyses. And we've started to pull back from that in some ways and like release less granular data, precisely because we know that it can be paired with all these other things in ways that can definitely, on the one hand, enhance understanding, but on the other hand, sort of compromise confidentiality.
I think
Well,
one oh if I could just
this is
add
sorry.
one thing.
Yeah, one quick thing.
Yeah, is to piggyback on that, I would just love to see us widen the scope of what makes good data in the sociology of religion in a responsible way. I've been calling for this for a very long time and kind of maybe seeing the trends. Maybe people are starting to see that we need to expand what makes good data, because a narrow data makes for narrow studies and narrow results.
Well, thank you, Gina, for summarizing all of this so well and ending us on that note. I want to thank everybody for joining us here today. Thank you so much to the panelists. Thank you, Joseph. Thank you to the center. Thank you for all of us who joined us. So grateful to have you here, and thank you for an excellent conversation today.